Yesterday, David Cameron set out the moral case for the government's changes to welfare. He said the criticism by the country's leading Catholic cleric, Archbishop Vincent Nichols, was simply wrong. Today, nearly half of the Church of England's bishops, along with Methodist and Quaker leaders, added their voices to criticism of coalition policy. In a letter published in the Daily Mirror, they say 500,000 people used food banks last year, and that over half of those say they've had to because of cutbacks to and failures in the benefit system. Whether by coincidence or not, this morning DEFRA released a report, which it has had for the last 8 months, which analyses the impact of food banks. Dr. Eric Jensen from Warwick University is one of the authors.
It was commissioned by DEFRA. They commissioned it in 2013, early 2013, in order to have a look at existing evidence on this issue of the role of food assistance in household food security.
So subjects like food banks were very much part of your research?
Indeed. Food banks were part of the research alongside a lot of other initiatives like meal projects, soup runs, food vouchers, community care projects, a whole range of things.
And what did you find about their growth and what's driving it?
There isn't robust peer-reviewed research on their growth in the UK, but there is reporting from agencies that conduct food banks as well as from those who refer people to food banks, like the Citizens Advice Bureau. In both of those cases, they're reporting quite substantial increases in the level of food bank usage.
So you'd be cautious about specific figures because there's no one sort of independently checking them, as it were, but there's a sort of consistent reporting that the numbers are growing.
That is exactly correct.
Lord Freud, the welfare minister, said in the House of Lords last summer that food banks are not part of the welfare system of the government and there are other ways of supporting people. And he was asked to clarify that. And he said, look, if you put more food banks in, that's the supply. Clearly, food from a food bank is by definition a free good, and there's almost infinite demand. I mean, by that, I would interpret him as saying, basically, if you create them, people will come. That doesn't necessarily mean there's a need for them in the first place.
We did look at this issue, and there is no systematic evidence on the impact of any increased supply of food assistance, including food banks. We found no evidence to support the idea that increased food assistance provision is driving demand. In fact, all of the available evidence, both in the UK and internationally, points in the opposite direction. The evidence suggests that there's more need, and informal food aid providers are trying to help.
The question that raises then is, what is driving the need? Why is there more need?
Well, again, there isn't robust peer-reviewed research on that topic, but there are reports from the Citizens Advice Bureau, for example, and the Trussell Trust and other providers that indicates that a range of issues are causing the kind of long-term need for food assistance, including indebtedness and rising food costs and low income, all these kinds of issues. But a lot of what seems to be driving the recent crisis, according to these sources, is problems with benefit delays and benefit sanctions. In particular, a forthcoming report from the Citizens Advice Bureau highlighted these two issues, benefit delays and benefit sanctions, as quite important drivers for the kind of crises for short-term food assistance needs.
Have you seen anything to cast doubt on that?
I've not seen anything to cast doubt on that, no.
Let me ask you finally, the report appeared this morning without any kind of public warning that it was coming. Indeed, it's been waiting for some months. I think it's fair to say you submitted it back in June last year. Did you know it was coming today?
We found out yesterday, very late, that it was coming out this morning.
You were asked to do the report in March. You completed it in June. Are you surprised it's taken until February to be published?
Yes, we were surprised, and we don't fully understand why there was that long delay.
Normally, would you have expected to get a bit more notice that it was coming out today?
Yes, we would have normally expected more notice, yeah.
Eric Jensen of Warwick University. Well, the Bishop of Manchester, David Walker, was among the 27 bishops who signed that open letter on welfare and hunger published in the Daily Mirror this morning. Bishop Walker, welcome. Can you explain, first of all, for those who haven't seen the letter, what your contention is about the causes, in your view, of the increased use of food banks?
Well, what we're finding is that this is about older people who are forced to choose between having the heating on or having breakfast. It's about children whose mums are faced with deciding who's going to go without a meal that day. Being on the breadline used to be a bit of a political metaphor. For 500,000 Britons, it's now a tragic truth, and the report we've just heard simply bears that out. And churches, we're very much involved with groups like the Trussell Trust on the ground, running food banks. There comes a point when you have to stop just alleviating the suffering and asking why. You start asking why people are falling in the river rather than simply pushing them and pulling them out when they end up downstream. And that's why we've now got the evidence. We've put today's letter in the public domain.
And your why is that your explanation for that is government policy.
Our explanation for that, it may not be intentional government policy, and we share the government's aspirations that work should pay, and we say that explicitly in our letter. We want to see work pay, but one of the big disincentives that we find for people taking up lower paid, insecure, perhaps temporary work is a very well-founded fear that when that work ends, there may be weeks before a fresh benefit claim gets processed, and legitimate concerns that mistakes in processing claims can lead to further delay or rejection. People can't save enough to tide them over those sorts of gaps in the benefit system.
You obviously have legitimate concerns, and the Prime Minister has said he doesn't have any objection to the churches expressing their views, becoming involved in the debate on public policy, but it's a bit provocative, isn't it, to present this story in the most pro-Labour newspaper in the country and not expect that it's going to be perceived as an attack on the government?
This wasn't an attempt to presented in one particular newspaper, and I don't know why any particular newspaper was chosen. You'd have to ask the people who invited myself and my colleagues to sign the letter.
But you can understand the effect, though, if it appearing in that paper.
But the point is that this is a story that's running across all the media today. That's what we needed to do to get this issue being spoken about, because we have people who have sanctioned huge amounts in their benefits because perhaps the one bus every 2 hours from their village doesn't turn up, they don't get into town, they don't make their appointments.
And is your, sorry to interrupt, but is your case that then government or government agencies are taking a more hardline approach now than they were in the past in these kinds of cases?
I think agencies do appear, from the evidence that we see, to be taking a fairly hard line on claimants, and actually they're the people who can afford the least in our society.
But I wonder if your kind of moral argument isn't a bit weakened by the approach you've adopted. I mean, for example, you use the figures you use. You say 5,500 people admitted to hospital in the UK for malnutrition last year. The Health and Social Care Information Centre, who are the source of those figures, say actually that includes people admitted for a different reason. So someone might, for example, be admitted for pneumonia, and then subsequently when they're looked at, they get an additional diagnosis of malnutrition. I wonder if you're just oversimplifying some of the argument you're making.
I think sadly all too often pneumonia is one of the consequences of malnutrition. The presenting issue when someone is first admitted into hospital is one thing. The underlying cause of why they've become ill is potentially
yes, but that's not how you put it in the letter. That's my point.
Well, I think we're clear that there are a number of figures in the letter. That's one particular one. I think there are 500,000 people who are reliant on food banks. I went to one food bank a few months ago and found the number of children it was providing meals for had more than trebled in the course of one 12-month period. Those are the kind of figures that we need to be paying attention to.
David Walker, Bishop of Manchester, thanks very much. Well, we approached the government to comment both on the DEFRA report and indeed on the letter from the bishops that's published today. All our requests for interviews were refused. But this morning, a cross-party group of MPs, which is concerned with food poverty, announced they were launching their own inquiry into the scale of the use of food banks. Laura Sands, Conservative MP, is among them, and she's on the line now. Laura Sands, welcome. You are clearly then concerned in principle about the use of food banks and the apparent need, according to the bishops, for them. Do you take the government's view that this is a kind of demand that's created by establishing food banks? You put them there, there'll be more of them, people will go to them because they're there and it's free, or do you think they're responding to an explicit need?
Well, I don't think, to be frank, we've got the answer to any of those questions. That's why Frank Field, myself and other colleagues are really, really keen to get to the bottom of the increase in food banks and food aid in its widest sense. I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned by the bishops, or in many ways stressed enough possibly by the DEFRA report, is that since 2000 we've had 30% increase in food prices. and you look at the people who are going to food banks, it's not so much, it's not just people who are on benefits, it's also people with low incomes. And I think we've got to be really clear that there might be something systemically wrong with the food system, not as much as other issues that the bishops raise.
And to be fair, they do make in the conclusion of the letter a reference to wanting government to look at how food markets operate and whether there are problems there. But just to be clear, you say we don't have the answers to these questions. Would you then prefer government ministers in future not to be using this argument if they can't substantiate it yet without evidence that creating food banks causes the demand?
No, I mean, I think that there are a wide range of reasons. There's the presence of food banks, but I mean, there is obviously very tight need and tight concerns by families who are on low incomes, who are, facing all sorts of different decisions in their lives. But what we've got to do, and this committee that Frank Fields has set up, will be looking at the whole range of things, from food prices to food banks to community shops that are evolving around the country. We must look at the food system in its totality and ensure that those families that are most stretched are supported in the right way.
Would you accept, though, that changes to the welfare system are part of this and have contributed to the demand?
Well, the facts don't totally bear it out. I mean, the food banks started to appear in 2000, and they increased by 20-fold up until 2005. This wasn't a period of welfare reform. So I don't think...
But have they not increased again in the last couple of years?
No, I think frequently people have said that it's sometimes about the system, i.e. when the welfare payments don't come in time and things like that, that has pushed people to go to food banks.
And any surprise about the report not having appeared for so long?
Well, I think we're all very pleased to see the report, and I think that it certainly highlights certain issues around the overall household food security. But I do think we need to look at food in a very comprehensive way, because there is something which is at the problem within the food system, and we've got to ensure that we get to the bottom of it.
Laura Sands, Conservative MP, thanks very much for joining us this lunchtime.